Greetings, adventurers. This is Chris, aka Nas, back with new adventures in Skyrim. Today is Friday Night Magic, and this video is for a friend of mine, Old Bearby, and the best brother a bear could have, Tommy Bear. So, this is the number 3. I apologize for the weirdness if you see my shadow. I'm improvising my spot because the nephew is here with my middle one. So here we go. So yeah, you may hear some kiddos going in the background. This is kids, yes. So this is the commander. I'm trying to wait for it to focus. Mizzix of the Izmagnus. This was my first good deck. So I started playing EDH, experimented with a few colors in decks that my buddies had, and this is where I went. And the way that works, zoom in maybe just a little, is, I'll pull it up again, when you cast an instant or sorcery, I'll just read it, right, or let you read that, and then I'll explain it in my own terms. So, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you will get a counter. So on your first one, you would get 1, and then any spell that is an instant or sorcery will be reduced by that much, and then it builds up. So from then on, it gets a little more complicated, and I'll go through the cards, and it will make a little more sense, hopefully. And I am not sure if you are familiar with experience counters, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But experience counters are one of the neat counters in that they are outside of the game, so opponents cannot interact with them. They can't take them away or remove them, and that's very fun. So the lands are pretty basic, which is a shame now that I want to go through and give it some love in that regard. So I'm not going to go much into that. I just had the Izzet Boilerworks out there because it's kind of on flavor with the Izmagnus is a mage branch of what without going too far into depth in the story of Ravnica. They are one of the guilds of Ravnica. The Izzet guild is a guild, and within that is the Izmagnus and their sect in there. So we're going to go into the cards. I'm going to try and slow it down because when I get excited like this, I'm sure I'm already rambling on a little faster than I want. And I want to make sure these cards go into focus when I do this. So we're going to move Izzy down here for now. That up here. I'm going to go through the deck kind of the way I like it to work out. And with that said, I saved the instants and sorceries for last, so that it'll make sense. This card is just wonderful. It's a little bit on the expensive side to cast, but as you can see, it just reduces spells. And there are a lot of spells in here that are both red and blue, and in those cases, it will reduce it by 1 for each. So those spells will be reduced by 2. I think I just went with the artifacts here. We have some mana rocks. Nothing too crazy. Sorry, I know the blur or the focus is a little slow. Trying to look through the camera, and I'm not good at this. So what I may do is that and I think, thank you for bearing with me. And we have Manascape Refractor, which again I have not even got to use that. So there we are, done with the artifacts. Now we're going to move into what I call kind of a secondary theme, which is stealing all of your stuff in here. So we have, now I went through, again, I'm an old Magic player, and for this deck when I was making it, I tried to, and I could make it a little better. There are sorceries and instants that, for example, steal enchantments, but I went a little old, and you'll see why in a moment. So we have Steal Artifact. I may just steal your artifact. Royal Elemental. This one is very bad for you. whenever I play a land, I get to steal one of your creatures as long as he remains on the battlefield. Then I may want to make a clone of Royal Elemental and play a land and steal 2 of your creatures with 1 island. Then I may go and play Gigantoplasm actually before I play the clone, or before I play that island, play that clone, play that Gigantoplasm, have 3 copies of a Royal Elemental and play that island, and then take 3 of your creatures with the 3 Royal Elementals I have. But before I do that, I may play my Clever Impersonator and make an additional copy, which would be 3. So I would take 4, potentially, with 1 island. That's perfect world scenario. I have this tricky one. This is a hit or a miss. I'll leave it there, and you can pause it to make sense of it. I'll stop for 1 second, so maybe you can do that. And the gist of it is, if you end up playing someone with a monocolored deck, red and blue are the most, and white, common, I believe, where I have trouble in that those go with very basic lands, and this ends up being a big swing and a miss. And then occasionally I go and find a deck that has 3 or 4 or sometimes even 5, which are almost no basic lands, and I get to drop some bombs with this guy. It can make or break me depending on the deck, and it can be a lot of fun. It can be a negotiating tool, it can be a threat, it can just be a lot of fun. Now the tricky part is if I'm not mistaken, whenever a time counter is removed, while it's removed, destroy target non-basic land. So the tricky part there is it's not a conditional effect. So if I, for example, put 4 counters and my opponent only has 2 non-basic lands and I have a non-basic land, I have to then destroy my own land. It'll make the creature stronger, but that's not my intention, so you have to be mindful with that. I love those. That is what draws me to the Izzet flavor. The red and the blue. The blue is the control, and then you have the red that kind of adds that chaos in that Izzet flavor, and that's what Izzet is about, which I laugh at. Izzet is about. And you'll see a lot of that flavor in here. The blue is very precise, and the red tends to be a little more hit or miss, swing hard or miss, and then the ones where it's both the red and the blue, you'll kind of see those separate elements come out in certain cards. This card is here because it's on theme, in that it allows me to target things that wouldn't normally be targeted by removing hexproof on opponents. And then you have the additional effect at the bottom, which can actually win you games in the unblockable. So if you're going to combat and want to swing big, but then there's the effect beyond that, where you can sacrifice it to, in fact, I think it's both, correct? Yes, so you can also add hexproof on your own creatures if someone's targeting a lot of creatures, you can stop that, correct it. Lightning Greaves, which is self-explanatory, it adds hexproof. Or no, I'm sorry, yes. Shroud. No, it's haste. I'm sorry, I'm getting them confused with the other boots. So yeah, these give haste and can't be targeted spells or abilities. So yes, it is Shroud. I was correct. And then this is, again, just a interesting little, some of these are at this point now are more just good cards that fit and complement the deck. Again, my Sad Robot does 2 things. Technically it can do 3. Come to the battlefield, get me a land, maybe block or attack or sacrifice and get me that card draw, or just sit out there for later when I get an option and I want to do that. And you have one part of a combo that I don't have in here because I don't like to play Magic like that, but there's a 2-piece combo with this card that can very much so lock down combat.
They're trying to say they heard the
Frost Titan. That's a wonderful one with that.
There's gonna be a free battle.
Well, with all of it, I'll let you read it. This one can be tricky again. In fact, this is what I talk about with the red and the blue aspect. This gives you the chance to have access to your cards, but then and the potential to use those, which is the blue, the calculated part. But then you have the red aspect, which is the first line you play at the top of your card revealed. In my opinion, that's a red big splash in the face, in that now I'm revealing that card. So that's where the tricky part of that comes in. It leaves you vulnerable, but also gives you access to something potentially at the same time. I love that tricky aspect of it. Goblin Electromancer, again on theme in that that's actually an Izzet card, and In fact, you can see the flavor text down there, and it's on point with the cards reducing instants and sorceries. And now while that does that, this gets bigger as I cast instants and sorceries. Another one, when I cast instants and sorceries, it gets bigger and does something else, which is tapping things that don't untap for a turn. Hypersonic Dragon is just, whew, that is a bomb in this deck. Being able to play all my cards, especially sorceries, at instant speed can be so much fun and change the entire direction of this deck. Mirari copies instants and sorceries. Pretty self-explanatory, I believe. Pyromancer's Goggles is a mana dork, but if you can read the second part, it has the potential to copy spells if you use it to cast instants and sorceries, and there happen to be those in this deck. I have not even got to ever use this card, sadly. Metallurgic Summonings. It's a mouthful. I'm going to leave it there and let you read it. And again, you get the instants and sorcery feel throughout this. Again, 1,000-Year Storm. Now that, again, is... in that Izzet flavor, it has that potential to get very dangerous very fast. And the flavor text is Ral, one of my favorite planeswalkers. This is a fun card because it can get big, but it also has the first ability, which is to bring instants and sorceries back to my hand, which that is good in this deck. And then if I cast it, he gets bigger and then goes and smashes opponents. Maybe I can put that one on him that gives him +2/+0 and unblockable. Play an instant with that card with the enchantment on it. If I play an instant or sorcery, he's already a 4/6 and unblockable. He becomes a 10/6 unblockable, and that's half, well, not half, depending on if you're playing 1v1 or group, but potentially half or a quarter of their life gone in one swing. Pretty self-explanatory. Again, in fact, I'm going to slow down because this is where we now get into the instants and sorceries. I'm going to try and slow down because we're already at 12 minutes, but I'm not going to try to rush through at the same time. This is where it gets key, and I'm going to do it in tempo in that I'm going to start with the lower one-cast spells, like this. And that card specific is wonderful because first and foremost it's one, but then it has two modes, and I like that. I like utility like that personally. And we have Lightning Axe. It has that... it's a one-drop, but it has that stipulation to it. Opt, which has one of my favorite characters, Teferi, depending on how you... It's Teferi, but I always say Teferi. That's just a one-drop, and again, 2 for 1, scry, and then draw. The scry ability lets me potentially cycle a card or say, yes, I definitely want that, right before I draw it. Then we move on to the 2s. Now, with that said, so, any of these spells that I had cast prior, so if I cast the one-drop, I would get a counter on that. And then if I played Fumble, for example, I would play it for just the blue cost removed, but the experience counter would remove the 1 generic mana, so that would cost just 1. So I'm going to start going through these. You can read those cards as we go through. Smash to Smithereens, damage and smashing your artifact, and again on instant or sorcery. This one is fun because it gets big fast in that I play it, get an experience counter for it, then use that mana to play another spell reduced by that spell. Mizzix Mortars, again, the beautiful thing about that is the 2 separate modes to it. I can wipe the board or just smash one of your creatures and get an experience counter. And again, if I have, say, for example, 3 of these, I can play the overloaded cost of 3 and 3 red for simply the 3 red. So that's the way this deck starts to work. This card has no effect in this deck in terms of the experience counters reducing its cost, but it being played can reduce, or I'm sorry, would be able to potentially add an experience counter because there's no generic cost in that. Whereas this 3 cost one would be reduced by, at this point, if we're going off of what I have here, 3, so I would cast that for just 1 red mana. Again, this has 2 separate modes, and I love the fact that it cannot be countered. As a blue mana player, that counters everything that I can when I want to. If I have a fun blue deck, that's very, very, very key. So, now let's say again we're at 3 experience counters and I play a spell like this. This gets really fun because of the kicker. So I can play it for its first mode right now as I have 3 mana counters for 2 blue mana, or I could play it kicked for a total of 2 blue and 7 generic mana, reduced by 3. So that would be the 4 generic and 2. So I would play that, pay 6 mana, potentially reduced by 3. And at that point, I would now bump that up. So next turn, if I play Etherize, I would play that for 1 blue mana. And then because it is equal to or greater than this, that would get bumped up. Now maybe in my hand I have that. And I'm going to play that for 1 mana, but it will not raise this unless I play it for its overload cost, which is now a potential because I have that reduced by 5. So I would simply do it for the 3 red mana. That's where this deck gets very dangerous, very fast. And then I have cards that now you'll start to see, and I passed a couple that start returning cards from, in fact, there was Charmbreaker Devil, which I love, because it brings these cards now back to my hand. We have Sleep, which again opens the way for combat. Structural Distortion, now I'm going after lands a little bit, which is kind of a no-no in Commander, but if you do it pointedly, it's not as bad. Keep in mind that is at sorcery speed, which is generally land destruction's fallback or limitation, I guess. But with my cards like Hypersonic Dragon, I can do that at instant speed. Here we go with value right there. I could potentially, again, if I was playing right now, play that for just the 2 blue mana, return artifacts and creatures to my hand, and then do the second mode, which is cast another card. Keep in mind, depending on when that is played, that can trigger this if I'm casting it, because it's not just playing the card, it's casting it. That's a little deep into this deck and what it can do. I hope that makes sense. But this, depending on how early or late you play it, has the potential to trigger at least once either way, and it's fun. Shreds of Sanity, or I'm sorry, Burn Away. I'm thinking of Shreds of Sanity. That's in here somewhere, I think. And again, I think you kind of get at, I just put that card in there and it's so wonderful. The art, I love the point of the card. And normally fight cards happen at only sorcery speed and green during your turn, and they normally fight your creature and an opponent's creature, whereas this I can do at instant speed during another opponent's turn, for example, and have them fight their own creature, or 2 opponents have 2 of their own creatures fight. I love that card. Word of Seizing, beautiful card. Again, has 2 little, well, it's a condition to it, but again, that one's unique in instant speed. Most of those where I take your creature and gain control of it till the end of turn in red are done at sorcery speed. That split second is another unique part. And then we start to go getting into the more unique bombs. And again, that awaken cost can be potentially influenced by this. If I want to go that route and get a big elemental, so then I can do Saheeli's Artistry, which again, this is, I believe, one of my top 5 favorite cards in Magic. It does so much. Ether Snatch, not Etherize. You can read it for yourself. Again, that's better than me butchering it. And again, keep in mind, if I were playing these spells at this point, now we'll say maybe I did just Ether Snatch one of your spells, so I'm going to bump that up to 6. Next one, again, this is an expensive counter and it's limited to creatures. I went with very limited counters in this. I have the 1 counter spell and then the other ones are relatively conditional. I try not to overload on counters because I tend to do that, but then if I do, I go big and conditional to do unique things like this, that draw card, at the conditional part of that, plus the expensive cost is what makes that card kind of unique in that deck. And this one can be very brutal. I'll let you read that. Mob Rule has won in many a game. Blatant Thievery. Again, I'm going to steal some more stuff. Then maybe take an extra turn. Again, so at this point, this card I would take an extra turn for 2 blue mana, knock that up to 7, then shuffle that card back into my library. Insurrection, very similar to Mob Rule, just better, bigger, and a lot more expensive. But again, at this point, that's just 3 red mana. Clone Legion, again, they're getting bigger and bigger, but now we're getting into the X spells. which are a little different the way they interact with the counters, but we have Open into Wonder, Comet Storm. That is a wonderful card. Again, if you read it, obviously I'm assuming you are doing that. It's instant speed and does to massive targets. It's a lot of fun. Jaya's Immolating Inferno is very similar. You can see it deals X damage to 3 targets. That could be 3 players. If I can get that up to wipe out 3 players at the same time, I've almost gotten that close and done it before. Very similar. Banefire is along those lines where it can't be fired, as I believe it was Urza's... I can't recall, but the other one that couldn't be countered, and I know it's an Urza card. And then this I just put in here for simple, again, the last one, ironically. My, harkening back to my old days. I love that it's an X spell and instant speed, and it's way back to 6th edition. So that's my Mizzix deck, my Izzet deck. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm sorry it took this long, but I hope you understand why. I hope you spent this time with me. Well, both of you, and take care of yourselves, take care of the ones you love, and we'll catch you on the next adventure. Until then, have a great day.